All right, let's get started. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to PIER Economics Seminar. My name is Don, and I will be your today's moderator for today's presentation. And today, it is our pleasure to have Meng Seunghyun, or Fred, with us today. Fred is an assistant professor of economics at Nanyang Technological University, right, in Singapore. Fred's research interests are in macro, international macro and finance, and also monetary policy stuff. His research topic has been on about the sovereign debt and sovereign default, most of it, right?
Yeah, fiscal monetary.
Yeah, and fiscal. Yeah. So today he'll be presenting his current paper on default, inflation expectation, and the currency denomination of sovereign bonds. In case participants have any question, would you prefer them to just raise their hand? Okay, just raise your hands and ask a question. So without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you for having me here. So today I'm going to present this paper. It's also my joint market paper, Default Expected Inflation and the Currency Denomination of Sovereign Debt. So first, the paper is about how the government manage their debt in emerging countries. So first of all, why we should care sovereign default, because this is the key concern in many emerging economies, because default risk affect inflation, output, and the business cycles in these countries. So there have been a huge development on this sovereign in this trend of literature, and recently there has been extensive research on the interaction between monetary policy and default risk. It's actually motivated by two key facts. So first of all, emerging countries from late 1990s and also early 2000s, they started to adopt inflation targeting as the monetary policy regime. And also Thailand started to adopt inflation targeting after Asian financial crisis. And the second motivating fact is that when default risk increases in the data, it is actually positively associated with a surge in expected inflation. And through the Phillips curve, higher expected inflation is going to lead to higher inflation today. Higher inflation actually then generate a trade-off between for the monetary policy between closing the output gap and stabilizing the inflation for the central bank, which is pretty much well known in the literature, I would say. However, this literature is kind of silent on how the debt management that should be managed by currency and how they interact with the monetary policy. So also the motivating fact is that in the data, emerging market government, they actively measure debt by currency in the data. So what this paper is going to do is to show that the debt management policy by currency can be used as a policy tool to improve the macroeconomic resilience in emerging countries. So it actually bridges default risk and the currency denomination and sovereign debt in the context of fiscal monetary interaction. I'm going to highlight later. So the first motivating fact is this. So FC is foreign currency, so or like dollar. Now from now I'm going to color that with have a abbreviation, which is FC. So here I have this foreign currency dash share and CDS spread. And CDS spread is the indicator commonly used as a default risk in the literature. So I have 15 inflation targeting companies, targeting countries in my sample. And what I'm doing here is to take the average value in the interquartile range from 2009 to 2019. So here you can see that on the left y-axis, I have the foreign currency dash share, and on the right y-axis, I have the CDS spread, which is the default risk. And you can see that among these inflation targeting emerging countries, when default, so the CDS spread goes up, then this country tend to borrow much more in foreign currency, so in dollar, relative to the local currency from abroad. So in this paper, I'm actually focusing on the external borrowing rather than the domestic borrowings, like the borrowing from the international financial market, borrowing from international investors. So then the research questions are pretty much clear. So then what factors are determining this government debt management policy by currency in these emerging countries? And what is the optimal debt management policy by currency? And the third question is what are the pretty standard macroeconomic questions? So what are the benefits of optimally managing this government debt? So what I'm gonna do is to build a small open economy, new Keynesian model with sovereign default. And in the model, I managed to have this default risk highly correlated with expected inflation in line with the data. So how do I generate that? So when I say default here, actually means the complete default, the outright default, binary choice, either 0 or 1. So when I say default, it's just the government just do not repay the debt at all. It's not, so how do I generate this high correlation between this default risk and expected inflation? So in my framework, the monetary policy regime depends on whether the government debt is repaid or not. So when the government debt is repaid, the central bank follows a very standard inflation targeting terror rule policy. Then once the default happens, so when the debt is not repaid, then the central bank deviate from inflation targeting and start to do the discretionary monetary policy. So there is a switch in the monetary policy regime when a fiscal crisis default happen. And this surge in inflation in default crisis actually is motivated by the fact that during the fiscal crisis, central bank would like to have higher inflation in order to boost the output and the tax revenue of the government, which I'm going to show you in detail later. So by having a surge in inflation during default crisis, then I can generate high correlation between default risk and expected inflation in the model, which is in line with the data. Then in this framework, I can show you that the local currency debt, like peso or Thai baht debt, actually provide these hedging benefits, just some consumption insurance, so state contingency relative to the foreign currency debt. What does it mean? So actually, if you borrow mostly in local currency, then in bad times, so when the consumption is low, inflation tends to be high in these emerging countries, and high inflation is going to reduce the real local currency debt burden. So it basically provides much better state contingency because relative to foreign currency debt, because foreign currency debt value is not affected by the fluctuation in inflation, I would say. However, currency debt, there's a trade-off. Actually, it incentivizes debt debasement through the expectation channel, which I would say is the novel to the literature. So let's say the fiscal authority here is facing a large amount of local currency debt. Facing a large amount of local currency debt, what the fiscal authority is going to do is to raise the debt issuance. By raising the debt issuance, what is going to happen? Default is more likely to happen in the future. And as I said, default risk is highly correlated with inflation. So higher default risk is going to lead to higher expected inflation. And through the Phillips curve, this is going to lead to higher inflation today. The higher inflation is going to reduce the real value of the local currency debt. But the issue with this kind of debt debasement is they generate distortions. So first of all, you see that there is a surge in the default risk, and default is bad in the sense that it generates debt value losses. And this is a first distortion, and there is a second distortion from a surge in inflation, because inflation is higher, and when inflation is higher, then when central bank conduct a monetary policy, it generates a trade-off between stabilizing the inflation and closing the output gap. That's the second distortion. Then in this sense, actually, this foreign currency debt or dollar debt is very nice in a sense they provide incentive to avoid this kind of distortionary debt debasement. So it provides discipline benefit. It cannot be debased, so it cannot be inflated away, so it actually prevents debt debasement and also helps to avoid these associated distortions. Then the paper is then simply about the trade-off between the foreign discipline benefit, so about the discipline benefit versus the hedging benefit. So as I mentioned, foreign currency that provide discipline benefits, and the local currency that provide hedging benefit. Then in bad time means there's the country is in a recession or the country is facing a large amount of debt, which features high default risk in the future. Then in bad time, the fiscal authority here is more likely to engage in this distortionary debt debasement and generate associated distortions. Then in this case, then the government borrow more in foreign currency in order to avoid this distortion from the debt debasement. So we basically highly value the discipline benefit offered by the foreign currency. However, in good time, we see the opposite. So when the economic condition is good or the amount of debt is low, so which means the default risk is low, then the country is less likely to engage in distortionary debt debasement. Then in this case, it issues much more local currency debt to benefit from the consumption insurance benefit from the local currency. Then you see that the model can explain the new fact I found. So when the country is more likely to default, it borrows more in foreign currency. So the currency denomination of sovereign debt is simply equating equilibrium that equate this discipline benefit and hedging benefit over the period. So do you have any questions so far? Okay. So this is the key trade-off in the paper. And then I do some quantitative analysis. I calibrate the model to Colombia. And why Colombia, right? So Colombia is the country that heavily rely on external borrowing. And that's why I target Colombia. And I find the model can explain the stylized fact, like relation between default risk and borrowing dollar, foreign currency. And then I do two policy experiments, one monetary and the other fiscal. So in the monetary experiment, I just gonna assume, okay, what is going to happen if the central bank just target inflation and there's no deviation from inflation targeting when there's a fiscal crisis. So when there's a default, let's say central bank doesn't deviate from the inflation targeting. Then I find that there's no surge in inflation in default crisis. Then the debasement mechanism I highlighted disappear because because there is no high correlation between default risk and expected inflation, the debasement mechanism I highlighted simply become non-existent. Then what is going to happen is that government counterfactually borrow less in foreign currency or more in local currency when default risk goes up. Because in this case, foreign currency then no longer provide the discipline benefits. So what is driving the government debt management policy is the hedging benefits, the consumption insurance over the periods. So when default risk rises, so it means that it's in a bad time. So in a bad time, I like to borrow more in local currency, have more insurance to smooth my consumption. But in the data, we don't see this negative. We don't see government doing that. Actually, it's doing the opposite. The reason is that there is a discipline benefit from the foreign currency debt because the government may just debase local currency debt through the expectation channel. And then in my second experiment, I do the fiscal experiment. I ban government from borrowing in foreign currency. And actually, I find that everything gets worse. Default happens much more frequently, and local currency debt spread goes up, and inflation also goes up. So different from what we generally think, actually foreign currency debt can be pretty much beneficial if it's used in a right way. So the paper basically then highlight this optimal debt management policy by currency can generate huge gain because it helps to improve the macroeconomic resilience for these emerging countries. So that's the quantitative result. And then I have some literature review. Let me go through it quickly. So there are some other work on this currency composition of government debt. In their case, they only look at how the monetary credibility affect the government debt management policy. So how monetary credibility affect how much government is borrowed in foreign currency and local currency. So I'm contributing to this trend of literature by showing that actually this debt denomination by currency can be driven by the fiscal problem, default risk, in the context of fiscal monetary interaction in default crisis. So there's a relation for inflation targeting in default time. And then there is also some work on default with nominal rigidities. So like, I would say in this trend of literature, there is no Phillips curve. But let me just skip this part. So, and the third one, there is a new Keynesian policy that bridges pricing friction and then the default risk. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the work that actually explain the interaction between the default risk and monetary policy, but not showing anything related to the debt management. So I'm also contributing to this trend of literature. And also there's some literature on the debt management policy and default risk by Arellano. And in their case, they show that short-term debt actually helps discipline, and long-term debt provide much more consumption insurance, so some better state contingency. So in that sense, actually, the foreign currency debt in my case is pretty much similar to short-term debt, and the local currency debt in my framework is pretty much similar to the long-term debt. But they don't have the monetary policy and the interaction between the maturity and so on. So I would say I'm also contributing to this trend of literature, and they also don't look at any currency denomination. Okay, let me show you some stylized fact, so empirical analysis. So this is the data I have. So I got this data from the IMF. So I have this 15 inflation targeting emerging market. The data is ranging from 2009 to 2021. So this is the list of the countries. So you can see it covers almost all the continent. Brazil, Chile, also I would say Thailand is also here. And this is the map of the my data sample. And what I have is this foreign and local currency government debt stock data. So it's in a book value. So it is not subject to the market value fluctuation. So I got this from the IMF. And in terms of the default risk, I have this default risk data, which is CDS spread, and it's denominated in USD. So it's from the Bloomberg, I would say. You can just view CDS spread as in dollar as the default risk. Okay. Then I do 3 regressions. The fact one. So I run regression on how much the government borrow in foreign currency in its total external borrowing from international financial market, and I run regression on that with respect to like risk and other macro control. I would say macro control include like inflation, re-exchange rate fluctuation, GDP growth, capital control index, capital openness index, and debt to GDP ratio, and the private credit to GDP ratio. The last one is the indicator, or whether the level of domestic financial market development. So I run regression on that. Then what you can see here is that when CDS spread goes up by 1 percentage point, these countries tend to borrow much more in foreign currency by 33 percentage point to up to 5 percentage point, I would say. And I control for the fixed effect and the time fixed effect. And then I would say it's pretty much robust. So it's robust to pre-pandemic sample. And also I try to control for the foreign exchange rate valuation effect, because it's a book value. It may subject to the foreign exchange rate fluctuation. So I control for that by having, I control for that, and it's still there, although it's a bit weaker. And also, instead of using the time fixed effect, I try to control for some global factor like U.S. monetary policy, like U.S. stock market, and so on. It still works. And because this is the debt stock data, I also look at how the share of foreign currency debt in newly issued debt changes by run a regression on through the first difference method. By looking at how much debt changes over the period, I see how looking at the new issuance of debt and the result still survive. So what I want to highlight here is that when a country is more likely to default, it borrow more in foreign currency or in dollar. That's the key fact. And there's fact two. So there's
sorry, can I ask a
yes.
question? I think you get this a lot. So how do you claim the causality here, or is
it's just a correlation? There is no causality.
Okay.
Because I would say like CDS fourth choice is Yeah, so I would say the CDS spread is an indicator of the default risk is endogenous, and the choice of debt is also endogenous. And if you ask, so I'm just showing, so I'm running the regression on something endogenous and on something, so it's just correlation. Then you may ask, like, why not use IV instrument? But the issue with that is that, like, then I need to find a variable that is correlated with CDS, but not correlated to their debt choices, which I would say is very, very difficult. Yeah, because everything is pretty much endogenous in this scenario. So that's why I'm only looking at the correlation. Okay. So this is the correlation. So that's why it's a fact one rather than the causality one. And there is a fact two. So the correlation between the CDS spread and expected inflation. So expected inflation data I got from Bloomberg. It's a 1 year expected inflation. And I take it's an institutional forecast. I take the median value of it, and I run regression on that, and I find very large correlation between CDS spread and expected inflation. So when default risk goes up by 1 percentage point, then expected inflation increases by 0.5 percentage point after control all these other macro variable, I would say. So it's so if the country is gonna default for sure, in a regression, you can see that, like, expected inflation is going to be around like 50%. So it's very inflationary, default risk is. And the last one is I look at the relative cost of borrowing. So why ITLC? So this is the yield in local currency debt, and this is yield in dollar debt. The difference between these two then indicate how much is relative cost of borrowing in local currency over foreign currency. So how much more expensive to borrow in local currency over foreign currency. I run a similar regression, and I find that it becomes much more expensive to borrow in local currency, like Thai baht, when a country is more likely to default. So what I'm going to do later, I'm going to use this fact 2 to explain fact 1 and fact 3. So fact 2 is going to motivate my fiscal monetary interaction in default crisis. And through that, I can explain fact 1 and fact 3. Okay? So let me build a model. So there are 3 key facts. So this is the environment. So it's a small open economy, new Keynesian model with solvent default. So I have only single final good. So only difference between this foreign currency and local currency debt is whether the debt is subject to the debasement risk or not. So I would say this is like, you can view actually this as a real debt and this as the nominal debt, something like that. Also. So I have 4 agents in the economy. I have the household, central bank, firm, and fiscal government. So what is not standard here is the central bank and the fiscal authority. The central bank, it does the monetary policy. And the monetary policy regime depends on whether the government debt is repaid or not. If the debt is repaid, the central bank target inflation following a Taylor rule, very standard one. And when the government default, then central banks deviate from this inflation targeting and start to do the discretionary monetary policy. And this is going to lead to a surge in inflation in default crisis that generate high correlation between default risk and expected inflation in the data. Then fiscal government here is decide whether to default or not, default or repay. And when it decides whether to default or to repay, it takes into account all these responses by the central bank. Okay? And also, if it repay, it borrow in foreign and local currency. So it borrow from foreign lenders, and foreign lenders here are just risk neutral, so they just do the risk neutral debt pricing. So I'm going to explain that later. So that's the main setting. And let me start with the household. So household value consumption, private consumption, and public spending, and they supply labor. So for simplicity, I'm going to assume they are fully separated, consumption and C, G, and N. And then what they do is just to consume and make some pay tax in a lump sum manner. So tax doesn't cause any distortion in my framework. And it trades some zero, like net supply, domestic bond. So this one is just to generate the Euler equation here, this domestic bond. So actually the household in my framework cannot hold government debt. Okay. So my focus is on the external borrowing. So when the government borrows, it borrows everything from international investors. So household here doesn't borrow anything from, doesn't provide lending to the government. So I have the two key equation for the household. So there is a real wage equation, I would say pretty standard, and then the household oil equation. And I have the so the interest rate is IT, and then the inflation is pi. Okay, and the firm here only hire labor to produce, and it set the prices, and they are subject to some Rotenberg adjustment costs. This is just to generate new Keynesian Phillips curve. So firms, there is one rule. So it just generate new Keynesian Phillips curve. So inflation today equal to marginal cost plus expected inflation, and that's it. You don't need to know anything more about it. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And the fiscal authority. So fiscal authority here is pretty like a social planner, but impatient social planner. So fiscal authority has its own discount factor, beta G, and it's lower than household discount factor to reflect the fact in the political economy that government is less patient than the household because there's an election and turnover and so on. So they are short-sighted relative to the household. So the government here is short-sighted, but it still tries to maximize the household utility. So what it does is to raise taxes from the household with some constant tax rate in a lump sum manner, so there's no distortion from the tax, and it decides it makes the fiscal decision whether to default or to repay. If it default, then it just default on everything. So like it's a 100% haircut, just for simplicity. Okay, so all that is eliminated, and for simplicity, I'm going to assume that there is some permanent tax losses as a penalty, and it's excluded from borrowing from the international financial market forever. So once it defaults, it has a tax revenue, tau multiplied by the aggregate output, z is the TFP, and n is the aggregate labor supply. So this is the tax revenue for the government. And there's some exogenous tax losses. So it just simply spend amount it collect, okay? And it cannot borrow from international financial market. And if the government repays, then it borrow from the foreign lender in both foreign and local currency. So if it repays, then you see that first it collects the tax and borrow in foreign and in local as price QFC and QRC, and then it spend, and at the same it repay the foreign currency debt and the local currency debt, and the local currency debt is subject to the debasement risk, as you can see here. Yes.
In your paper, like, do you look at like the other benefit of like issuing the foreign currency debt? Like, for example, like you can access like the cheaper like debt at like access, like you can issue that at a cheaper rate from like having access to wider like capital markets. Because like in your previous slide, like you when you mentioned about the benefit of like the FC, like the foreign currency debt, you mentioned only about the disciplinary sort of benefit, right?
Yeah.
But one other benefit was like
bond price, interest rate.
Yeah.
You will be reflected in equilibrium. So when foreign investor they lend to the government, they set the interest rate based on what the government is going to do. It's based on rational expectation. So it will be clear when I explain the bond pricing formula.
Yeah. Okay. The second follow-up question would be follow from my previous things that I discussed before. When you look at like the penalty that like the government have to face in default.
Yeah.
Here you only mentioned about the permanent tax loss, but I think more importantly would be like the lack of access like to the international capital market. Is that also model in your?
Yes. So you see like once there's a tax losses and you cannot borrow from the international financial market. So it's excluded from borrowing from the international financial market once it default, because no one trusts the government anymore. So it cannot borrow anymore. So that's why you don't see this borrowing, this QFC, BFC here. Yeah, so it's excluded from borrowing. So it's just at the financial autarky. It just simply consume what I have in my pocket. So I cannot borrow from the financial market. So I will show you the bond price formula later. Yeah. Yeah, there is no domestic credit market. So that's why I mentioned at the beginning that like household cannot hold the government debt because I'm focusing on the external borrowing. So this is on purpose, I would say. Yeah. Okay, so this is what fiscal government does, and then this is the central bank. So central bank is when the monetary policy depends on whether the government debt is repaid or not. So when the debt is repaid, the central bank conduct a monetary policy following the very standard theory. Okay? So when inflation goes up, it raises the nominal interest rate more than inflation. When default, and I'm going to allow for this optimal deviation from the central bank, from the rule-based policy by the central bank. So central bank in this case start to do the discretionary monetary policy. And this is going to feature a surge in inflation. Why? Because there is a tax losses, exogenous tax losses when default happens. Then central bank would like to raise inflation in order to enlarge the output gap, boost the economy, so to lead to higher GDP. Then having higher GDP can actually lead to higher tax revenue and the government spending. So that's why there is a surge in inflation if the central bank deviates from inflation targeting in default crisis. So this actually can generate high correlation between expecting inflation and default risk in the model, which is in line with the data. So that's the way I generate high correlation between these two. Okay. So this is not something standard. So I allow for this deviation during the crisis. And
Sorry, is the rule is switching?
yeah, there's a switching rule exactly when default
And-
happens.
So when the default happened, the central bank used the other rule and
Exactly. Repayment happens, they just target inflation. So and there is a switch in monetary policy regime when default happens.
And do the central bank know before that the default gonna happen or not?
Then it doesn't deviate from that. So it only deviates when default crisis happens.
And there's no expectation about the default.
There is an expectation about default, which is going to characterize the debt management by the government, actually.
Okay.
So the expectation that there is a deviation is going to affect the government debt choices today.
But it doesn't affect the central bank choice.
Or it's also affect. There is a trade-off because of that. I'm going to show some like trade-off when the government issues that later.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So let me define the Markov equilibrium. So I have an initial state, exogenous state Z, and then the outstanding stock of debt B in foreign and local currency. And the government decide and try to maximize the household welfare using its own discount factors by making fiscal decision. First, it decides whether to default or not. If it repays, then it decides how much debt to issue. Then if it default, there's a tax losses and stays at the financial autarky forever, for simplicity for now. Then when the government make the fiscal decision, then it takes into account how it's going to affect the equilibrium location in domestic market like C and W pi I, and also bond prices or the interest rate on government debt. So let me quickly characterize some equilibrium. Like it looks very complicated, but let me characterize the equilibrium when default happens. So there's actually it looks very complicated. So trying to emphasize here is that like the central bank, when default happens, chooses the nominal interest rate and try to maximize the welfare of the whole economy. So it does the optimal deviation from inflation targeting to help the economy. That's what central bank is gonna do. So this is the case when default happens, okay? Then there's a government, so there are several equations you need to know, and there's a government budget constraint. So public expenditure is equal to tax revenue minus exogenous tax losses. And there are Euler equation, real wage equation, how the household budget constraint from the household side, and you can see a Phillips curve. So you can ignore this part, okay? It's like just focus on this. So because there are tax losses when default happens, then the central bank, the discretionary monetary policy done by the central bank is going to feature a surge in inflation. Why? By having a higher inflation, the central bank can actually boost the output. By having a higher output, it can increase the tax revenue and the fiscal spending. That's why there's a surge in inflation in default crisis. And actually reflect this fiscal monetary interaction in fiscal crisis in a sense that monetary policy respond to the fiscal crisis. So that's what I mean by fiscal monetary interaction in default crisis. So this is what is going to happen default. So what I want you to remember is just one thing. So there is a surge in inflation during default crisis because central bank does the discretionary policy to help the economy. How about the repayment state? So if the debt is not repaid, then now the government here decide how much debt to issue and decide the debt denomination by currency. So given the initial state and for each issuance of debt, then the private sector, the domestic allocation can be characterized by the following formula. So there's an interest rate rule from by the central bank. So in this case, it does the monetary policy following the central bank Taylor rule. And there's a Euler equation, real wage, household budget constraint. I mean, this is from the household. And again, there's a new Keynesian-Phillips curve. Inflation today equal to marginal cost plus expected inflation. So what I want to highlight here is that, because initially I assumed this utility function featured the full separability. So what does it mean? So the change in G then does not have any impact on private equilibrium directly, in a sense that change in G doesn't affect the utility of the marginal utility of consumption and marginal disutility of labor, and none of the variable here is associated with G directly because it features full separability. However, the government here can still affect private equilibrium through the expectation channel. Why? Because if the government issues a lot of debt, default is more likely to happen in the future, so expecting inflation is going to be high. High expecting inflation is going to raise the higher inflation today, and this is going to affect the private equilibrium allocation and also interest rate set by the central bank. Is it clear? Then what is nice about the model is that I can represent the private equilibrium at the schedule of B prime, in the sense that the government decide whether to default or not based on how much debt is going to owe tomorrow. So if government issue a lot of debt today, a lot of B prime, then it's more likely to default tomorrow. So B prime can be an indicator of the default risk. So I can represent everything as a schedule. And so this is the equilibrium when the repayment happened. And last part I like to highlight in the model is the bond price formula. So I have foreign lenders who lend to the fiscal authority here in foreign and local currency, and they are just risk neutral. They are so rich that they are doing is just a risk neutral. These foreign lenders. So the foreign currency debt price then reflect the probability of repayment, and local currency debt price then reflect the probability of repayment, and what is going to happen in next period on the inflation. So so I think I answered your question that the bond price that reflect whether the debasement is going to happen or not, whether the default is going to happen or not also. So this board B is representing the function. Then you can time inconsistency problem in this bond price formula. So R prime is the repayment set. Okay, so if the government issue a lot of local currency debt today, the government next period is going to do something crazy to raise the inflation through this expectation channel. And when lenders, they lend, they take that into account, and this is reflected in the bond prices in local currency. So that's the time inconsistency issue in the model, I would say. So let me quickly characterize the trade-off of borrowing in local and foreign currency. So local currency is nice because it provides some hedging benefit, which is reflected in this covariance term. So what does it mean? So when inflation is large, during the time when the government is poor, so when G is low, which is represented by the negative covariance term, then local currency debt is very nice in the sense that the government repay less when it's poor. So when G is low, when the country is hit by the negative TFP shock, or the outstanding debt stock is large, or both. However, so this is the nice benefit of local currency debt. However, there is some issue with local currency debt in the sense that it incentivizes the debt debasement and generate distortion. So local currency debt incentivizes this debt debasement through the expectation channel. So this is new Keynesian-Phillips curve. Inflation today equal to marginal cost plus expected inflation. That is, expected inflation term can be decomposed into two parts. Expected inflation term when repayment happen, expected inflation term when default happen. So R prime is the repayment set, D prime is the default set. So by issuing more debt, default is more likely to happen. So they enlarge the default set and shrink the repayment set. Then larger default set is going to lead to higher expected inflation because default is associated with a surge in inflation, which is going to lead to an increase in inflation today. That's the way to debase the local currency debt by the fiscal authority through the expected inflation channel. Then foreign currency debt is nice in a sense they provide some discipline benefit. So debt debasement is very distortionary. Why? Because so these distortions are reflected in the bond price and the output. So first of all, so government is going to debase the local currency debt, and foreign lenders, they are not stupid. They set a price based on rational expectations. So they anticipate that debasement, and they are going to lend at much higher interest rate when they lend. That's the first distortion from reflecting the bond prices. And also, anticipation of the debt debasement is going to lead to lower output. How? Debasement is going to happen, which what it means the expected inflation is going to be high. Through the Felix curve, higher expected inflation is going to lead to higher inflation today. And central bank facing a higher inflation is going to raise the nominal interest rate because now it's a repayment stage, so it targets inflation following the Taylor rule. So higher inflation lead to higher nominal rate, and this is going to lead to lower aggregate demand and lower GDP in equilibrium. So that's a second distortion through the general equilibrium effect. And foreign currency debt cannot be debased, so it's nice in a sense they have to avoid these two distortions. So bond pricing, if I borrow in dollar or foreign currency, then I can reduce the ex ante cost of borrowing. That's the first benefit. And second, in terms of output, if I borrow in foreign currency, I can reduce the output losses originating from anticipation of the debt debasement. So that's the benefit of the foreign currency debt. And the currency denomination of sovereign debt then simply equate this hedging and discipline benefit in equilibrium over the period. Any question?
Well, actually, I have a quick question. I saw that you borrow from foreign lender only, both in foreign currency and local currency. So I just wondering what prohibit you from the model from borrowing from the local lenders in local currency?
So you mean what if the
Right. So if you want to borrow foreign currency, right? So we go to the international market, borrow from the foreign investor. If you want to borrow in Thai baht, why do we borrow from abroad in your model? Because
so I will say that so there are two reasons. So first of all, why they borrow from abroad, and second reason is why they so let me ask the first question. So why they borrow from abroad? So many emerging countries, like they first of all their financial market is now well developed. So the government then have to rely on the external borrowing. And at the same time, the tax base is very much limited. So for instance, Thailand has a very large informal sector. So it's very hard to collect taxes from this informal economy. So it has to rely on the external borrowing, I would say. And then why they cannot just borrow everything in Thai baht from the local resident, because maybe this is not enough for the government, probably. Yeah. Also, it depends really on the development of the financial market domestically. Yeah. Well, I would say it can be very different in a sense that then like So I will put in this way. So like then when the central bank set the monetary policy or do some policy, then it may not just affect the bond prices and distortion I highlighted here. It may also affect some welfare of the household. So it can get much more complicated, and there can be some extra channel that maybe I can look at. But here in my empirical analysis, I try to control for that. I would say like through I control for like development of the financial market and also country-specific factors and so on. So.
Also follow-up question. So I would suspect that if you allow domestic residents to lend money to the government, as in many emerging markets, like in Thai markets, most of the government bonds are held by Thai investors. So if the government were to default, then you would get like a huge wealth effect on household, right? And that would increase the trade-off. Like it's like if you introduce that mechanism, then borrowing locally might be even worse off in terms of social welfare if you introduce the wealth channel. Right.
So I would say the key mechanism I'm trying to highlight here is that like default happens, and then if it happens, then it could be like, as you say, it could be partial default, it could be any kind of default. But in the data, what you can see is that there is a very high correlation between expected inflation and default risk. As long as this relationship survive, then I can show the mechanism I'm highlighting here actually survive. So through this fiscal monetary interaction and default crisis, I can show that this actually affect the debt denomination by currency by the government. That's actually the key message of the paper. So does it answer your question or? Thank you. Yes, please.
I would like to clarify if I understand correctly about the bond pricing. Like the foreign currency bond doesn't impact the inflation expectation, right?
It also affects if the default is going to happen.
So it affects the inflation expectation indirectly through the default risk.
Exactly. So doesn't matter what kind of currency I'm going to borrow. If the default is going to happen in the future, this is going to affect the expected inflation.
And the pricing also take into account both.
Yeah, exactly. So you see the pricing here. So the pricing, bond price of the foreign currency reflect the probability of repayment, and the bond price in local currency reflect probability of repayment and expecting inflation tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so let me quickly do the quantitative analysis. I calibrated model to Colombia because it's a country that rely really heavily on the external borrowing. Around 50% of their government debt is from the foreign investors. So I calibrated the model to Colombia for this period, and the utility function features full separability is pretty standard. And I assume tax losses following this convex function in line with the literature. And different from the model I showed, I'm going to introduce some re-entry to the financial market, some stochastic re-entry entry to the financial market after default with some probability iota. And then to match the data, what I have done in my empirical analysis, I use the 5-year debt maturity in empirical analysis. So I'm going to introduce the long-term bond in line with that maturity with quarterly coupon rate, kappa, and duration 1/lambda. So there is so TFP is following this AR process, and this is the parameter I would like to highlight. So first of all, like first two, you can just ignore this so inflation target in Colombia is around 0.75% quarterly, and inverse of the debt maturity, like it's a 1/0.05 is equal to 20, so it's 20 quarter debt maturity equal to 5-year debt maturity, I would say. And the market reentry probability, I assume, is going to happen every 4 years in line with the estimation by Benjamin Wright. And there are some parameters that I need to derive through the moment matching. So first, I can observe private discount factor And so I'm going to match private discount factor with the by matching the domestic interest rate, and also I can also the government discount factor, and also so I'm going to use this to match average debt to GDP ratio, and also the default, like some tax losses function. I'm trying to match this debt spread and average inflation. Okay, and this is targeted. Okay, so I would say it works pretty well because they are targeted. So this is the from the Columbia, and this is the baseline result. And you can see it works pretty well. Like, I mean, it's targeted. So what is going to, so let me show you something on targeted. So first of all, I find the model works pretty well, like in terms of untargeted moments. So first of all, like in terms of mean, like the share in the foreign currency debt share in external monitoring in the baseline is around 77%. In the data is around 79. The spread of local currency debt is pretty much similar. Standard deviation also pretty much similar, I would say. Inflation volatility also very much similar, with the data. How about the correlation? So this is the correlation that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. So I showed the positive correlation between 5-year CDS spread, so 5-year foreign currency debt spread, with correlation with between this spread, CDS spread, and foreign currency debt share is between inflation and relative cost of borrowing. This is what I see in the data, and this is one generated by the model. So you can see that we managed to generate correlation that are in line with the data. That's the key result. And let me just skip it. I just showed to the because of the time limit. So just to conclude, I would like not to conclude. So the key mechanism here is this fiscal monetary interaction in default crisis lead to a surge in inflation in default time. Then through this expectation channel, then the government can debase the local currency debt. So it borrow in foreign currency to avoid the distortions. So then there are two questions. What if I constrained the monetary responses by the central bank to the fiscal crisis? What if and also the second question I like to answer is, what if I constrain the debt choices by the government? What if the government cannot borrow in dollar or foreign currency at all? So I do two experiments, and this is the first experiment. So I'm going to constrain the monetary policy responses. So there's no discretionary policy in default crisis. So central bank just follows the Taylor rule. It doesn't deviate from the Taylor rule at all during default crisis. Then default only lead to a loss in tax revenue, right? And because default only, and at the beginning, I highlighted that the utility function featured the full separability. And at the beginning, also when I characterize the private equilibrium, show you that the fall in government spending doesn't have any impact on private equilibrium because it doesn't affect the marginal utility of consumption. It doesn't affect the marginal utility of labor, and so on. Then what does it mean? This tax losses alone doesn't generate any impact on private equilibrium at all. So default become orthogonal to inflation. Why? Because G doesn't affect this private equilibrium at all. So I'm going to call this as NK orthogonal model. Because default become orthogonal to inflation, then expectation-driven become non-existent. So foreign currency borrowing in this case is not needed for disciplining purposes. So I can, through this experiment, I can also measure how much of the foreign currency debt is actually attributed to this discipline benefit of the foreign currency debt through this strict Taylor rule policy. And this is the key result, I would say. So you see that in the baseline with this fiscal monetary interaction in default crisis, I can generate positive correlation. But once I shut down this expectation-driven debt debasement mechanism, so when I shut down this fiscal monetary interaction in default crisis, the sign flips. So it means that, so actually in this case, what is driving the government debt management policy is the hedging benefit of the local currency debt. So when I'm poor, I want to borrow less in dollar or more in local currency because I want to be insured in this NK orthogonal case. But in the baseline, that's not the case because if in a bad time, I'm like in the in the bad time, I like to have more insurance, but at the same time, I'm more likely to generate distortion through this expectation channel. So instead, I borrow much more in foreign currency rather than in local currency when the time is bad. And also you can see that the correlation in expected inflation and CDS spread is pretty close to zero relative to the data. So in the data is very much higher. So actually, so this experiment actually highlights the default risk alone cannot explain the data. So you need some fiscal monetary interaction in default crisis to together with the default risk to explain what you observe in the data. So, okay, I think I explained everything here. So let me show you some other things. So, so let me just skip this part. Yeah, I like to also highlight that that is much more sustainable in this NK orthogonal case, because it becomes much more painful for the country to default in NK orthogonal case because the central bank doesn't help to resolve the crisis, doesn't come in to clean up the mess. So it becomes much more painful. So the debt is much more sustainable in this NK orthogonal case. And the spread of local currency debt is also much, much lower, I would say. It's lower by 1.4 percentage point. And lastly, yeah, also you see that the share in foreign currency debt dropped from 70% to 42%. So in NK orthogonal specification, no discretionary policy is going to lead to a drop by 35 percentage points in the dollar borrowing or foreign currency borrowing. So it actually means that discipline benefit account for very large amount of foreign currency borrowing in the emerging countries or for Colombia in this baseline specification. Okay, then this is the last experiment, so it's almost done. So I constrain the fiscal choices. So that choice is by the fiscal authority. So I'm going to assume the government can only borrow in local currency rather than foreign currency. And I'm going to happen. So what I can show, to summarize, actually everything gets worse because the government cannot use this foreign currency debt to avoid distortion. So you see inflation goes up relative to the baseline, and the inflation volatility also goes up relative to the baseline. And debt to GDP ratio also goes, actually is now lower. So you see it was previously 18.6 debt to GDP ratio, and now it become low once the government only borrowing in local currency, which is 17.8. That spread higher and the spread volatility also much higher. Default frequency also goes up. So actually then it highlights the importance of optimally managing the debt denomination by currency for the emerging countries. So to conclude, so the paper documents 3 facts, some correlation between the default risk and foreign currency debt share, expected inflation, and relative cost of borrowing. Then the paper then highlight the joint role of the default risk and this fiscal monetary interaction in default crisis. So deviation from inflation targeting in default time that drives the observed fluctuation in debt denomination by currency. So the paper highlight the 2 key trade-offs associated with foreign and local currency debt. And I find country borrow more in local currency when the time is good and borrow more in dollar when time is bad. And yeah, I think just quantitatively works well. And I highlighted that it's important to manage the debt in an optimal way by currency because it generates a lot of gains. So so that's it. So I think I finished on time. Yeah.
Does any participants have any questions further?
Well, as I mentioned, also basically in my empirical analysis, I find some correlation, and I through the model. I mean, in the model there is some causality for sure, but because otherwise it's impossible to build a model. And so through the correlation, it motivates the model structure, and then I try to use the model to explain what is happening in the data. But as I mentioned at the beginning, like it's very hard to find an instrument that is orthogonal to that choices, but correlated with default risk, I would say. So you just cannot find a, yeah. If you can find one, you can tell me, yeah. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Yes,
So
please.
first about what if you introduce the flexible exchange rate here, because I think the exchange rate is fixed.
Oh, actually, yeah. May I ask?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here, like there is an exchange rate, but it's implicit. So exchange rate here is the same as the inflation. So when inflation goes up, the currency depreciates. Then to answer your question further, so you may ask then, so nominal exchange rate in the data are composed by two things, like real exchange rate and the inflation. So inflation here, I've already considered, as I've considered the inflation in the paper. In terms of the real exchange rate, I would say, yeah, the mechanism can be different. So the country can maybe induce some real exchange rate depreciation to reduce the local currency debt, maybe. But the mechanism actually is completely opposite. So to country to devalue the local currency debt through the real exchange rate depreciation, actually the government should consume less to induce the real exchange rate depreciation. But in my mechanism, the government should consume more. By borrowing from abroad, it should consume more to induce a surge in inflation. So it's the opposite. So I think it will be interesting to see which one is dominating in the data, I would say. But here I'm not focusing on the real exchange rate fluctuation. So that's why I assume the single final good economy.
And the second question, I don't know whether you have the steady state here. I think.
Oh, so that's also the great question. So yeah, I would say the steady state is stochastic. So like it's there's no single steady state. So there's a distribution of the steady state, I would say.
Okay. Yeah. Is it different between the country that have the high external debt and the low external debt? Do the sensitivity change when you do the calibration? Because I think in the Colombia they have only 18% of external debt, right?
50%.
50%. How about the country that have maybe lower or higher external?
Yeah, Mexico also have the similar ratio of the external debt over the total, external debt over the total debt. But like actually many other countries, maybe like for instance, like India, they have a better domestic financial market. So they have a larger domestic base. So they, in their case, they rely much less on the external borrowing, like for instance, India. Yeah. So that's why I only used Colombia, but I think I can also try to calibrate to the Mexico.
Just a quick question. So we talk about a bit like that in the past, like countries tend to borrow in foreign currencies, right? And are these mechanisms explain the change in the trends that they are reduced from like 90 to about 40-50%, or are the things driving the change in the ratio of the foreign versus local currencies borrowing?
So I would say, so this actually, the one I presented is related to the original scene of the emerging countries. So emerging countries borrow like mostly, like almost everything in dollar from international financial market, especially during like 1990s and also early 2000s. And this trend got changed because maybe emerging countries, they develop a better financial market, or maybe they gain some monetary credibility. So it went down from like 95% of the dollar borrowing to maybe 60 to 50% of dollar borrowing. But the issue, as you can see here, let me show you not this one. Yeah, just back to intro. So you see, like there was a huge drop around this time to here, and you see it just fluctuate around here. And the question is why, like why they cannot even reduce their reliance on foreign currency debt, borrowing even further. And I try to explain that through the default risk and the fiscal monetary interaction, I would say. Yeah. It was much higher, like 90 in the past. Yeah. but it's just, yeah.
Okay, so the setup in your paper is for the inflation targeting economies, right?
Yeah, only inflation targeting.
Yes. So then for the inflation targeting framework, usually put emphasis on the central bank independence and also put some form of rules in terms of targeting the medium term inflation. So do you think that for this economy, are they well protected from the incentives for debasement of the for the local currency debt in the first place?
So here, all the debasement I highlighted is actually done by the fiscal authority. The central bank here, during the repayment state, like it target inflation. So it just simply do the Taylor rule. And all the debasement I highlighted is actually driven by the fiscal authority through the expectation channel. So if the fiscal monetary interaction in default crisis and default risk, both of them still exist, and then I would say the mechanism I highlighted in the paper still exists, I would say. Does it answer your question? So you mean
I'm just wondering, like in reality, like will this actually happens? Like the inflation targeting economy is like abandoning or deviating from their medium run target a bit, like in order to do the debasement. Will this actually happen?
I would say if it's a fiscal crisis, maybe. I don't know.
So so sorry, I didn't fully understand the question. So
yeah, so the key mechanism of the model is that during the time of crisis they will deviate and perform some sort of a debasement of the local currency debt. Yeah. So I'm wondering if they because of the setup, this is for the inflation targeting economies, like trying to put emphasis on the central bank independence, like putting some form of rules.
That would help, yeah, for sure. If you make the deviation much harder for the central bank, then you would help. So basically, like you see that, like so to avoid foreign currency borrowing, so you should do like either make the deviation from inflation targeting very difficult, or reduce the default risk, build some fiscal discipline, or or both. Which I would say, yeah, so that's the policy implication. So if the central bank is completely independent, it can just do what it said in the mandate all the time, then we would have the experiment one. Then it will be like the sign will flip, I would say.
I have a question on your reasoning for using the separable utility. So is it common for literature in this field to use like separable G and
yeah, that's also a great question. So I would say, so I choose this separable utility for the model purposes. So I want to do the decomposition, like how much of the foreign currency borrowing is driven by the discipline benefit.
Right.
So I need to make the default orthogonal to the default orthogonal to the inflation to see the result. That was intentional.
Right.
And if there is some like suitability or the complementarity between private and like government spending, private consumption and government spending, then the paper is not just about how the expectation channel drives that denomination by currency. It's become also a paper about how the complementarity and
right. Because I think your takeaway is heavily based on assumption of separable utility, right? Because you are trying. So the only channel that feedback through the utility is through the inflation. But so that is also by design that you separate the G term out of other utility. But it would be some other feedback loops if you include it in, for example, CES or other utility form.
Yeah. So that can be, I would say, some future work that I may do in the future. But because the main focus of the paper is about these expectation channels, I want to just focus on that. But in the future, I can also try to like make a more general model, like not just single final good, maybe multiple final good, and also with the complementarity and substitutability between these good, different good and decompose it.
Right.
But for the future work. Yeah.
And another question is on, I may have missed it, like what is your debt dynamics in the model?
I skipped it because of the time limit, but yeah, it's here. So this is left-hand side is the foreign currency debt share, how much I borrow in dollar, like 50%, 70%, 90%. And this is the outstanding stock of maturing debt, like I would say in foreign currency debt to GDP ratio. So if I have more liability, I choose more, I borrow in dollar or foreign currency. And also you see CDS spread goes up. That's the dynamic. And also this is the one I plot for the productivity. So this is recession, this is good time. And you see I borrow more in dollar or foreign currency in a recession relative to the good time because of the discipline benefit.
But I mean, the default risk is not dependent on the level of debt to GDP, right?
Which one? Sorry?
Like usually the default risk would move along with the higher debt to GDP over time. So like the more you borrow, the more interest expense compared to the debt would increase, and then you will get higher chance of default. But that is not what you focus in a model, right?
It's an optimal choice by the government to borrow more in dollar here. So I mean the borrowing cost would surge, but relative to borrow in local currency, it's actually much cheaper to borrow in foreign currency. So if instead, so let's say counterfactually, not like if the government borrow like let's say 30% in foreign currency, and like if the borrowing cost will be much higher if the government borrow like less in foreign currency in this case.
Right.
Yeah.
I think my point is like the cost would vary with debt to GDP level of different countries, which has also different like R minus G gaps.
Yeah, because also they have different inflation target and so on. So it can the cost of debt could be very different for different country for sure. So I'm just looking at Colombia because they rely heavily on yeah, that's why.
All right. If there is no other question, then thank you so much, Fred, for having for coming out to us today. And your presentation has been very interesting. I'm pretty sure that we learned a lot about like the interaction between like how fiscal and monetary policy can shape the like decision of the government. So if you have further question and like a one-on-one talk with the presenter, then please feel free to do so. Otherwise, thank you everyone for being here today.